Hey, everybody. Good morning. I am super excited to welcome Andrew Olsen to People of Substance, and he brought a friend. He will introduce his friend momentarily here. So Andrew and I have known each other sort of in passing casually over the years for a number of years in the industry. But right now, Andrew is he's the president of the Altus Marketing. He can talk about that, but he also produces the Rainmaker Fundraising podcast. And he has a couple books written about 101 biggest mistakes nonprofits make and how you can avoid them. So we'll talk about that. I have many questions. And then his more recent book is The Fundraiser's Guide to Closing Big Gifts. Closing Big Gifts?
Landing Big Gifts, yeah.
Okay. So Andrew, do you want to introduce yourself and your buddy?
Yeah, Olga, thanks for having me on today. And hello, everyone. I'm Andrew Olsen, and this is Aoife. She is our baby Nigerian dwarf goat. So she's the most friendly animal on the farm right now. And I thought we'd just bring her on to say hi. She's way cuter than I am. She'll only stay for a minute because she's a little bit nervous and shaky right now. But I'm glad to be here, and I'm looking forward to talking about fundraising, toxic leadership, culture, anywhere you want to go.
Yeah. So before we get to fundraising stuff, I've been dying to ask you. So I'm an animal person. I only have one animal living in the house, if you don't count the children. Okay. But I follow several possums on Instagram. Like I will take the opportunity to go pet all sorts of animals. So how many animals do you have, and what are they, and how did that come about?
Wow. Okay. So we have 2 Jersey steer. We have 2 Gloucester Old Spot pigs. Mm-hmm. We have 3 Mangalitsa pigs. We've got about 8 of these Nigerian dwarf goats. We have somewhere around 60 chickens.
60 chickens.
About 60 chickens. Yeah. About 25 ducks. We've got 3 dogs and a cat.
So like you have a lot of eggs. Like you have a small egg production.
In fact, if anyone is in East Tennessee and needs eggs, hit me up. We'll hook you up.
Wow. Okay. Okay. Well, let's talk about nonprofit things as much as I.
All right. I'm gonna let Aoife go.
Bye, Aoife.
All right. Say goodbye.
Bye. So Aoife is officially the first farm animal, or any animal for that matter, that made the live stream. So
awesome.
Yes, it's a very exciting moment. So I'm just gonna jump right in. I wanted to ask you first and foremost, how did you get into nonprofit field?
I fell into it, right? So, people like you and I, our sort of cohort in this industry, very few of us went to college specifically to go into nonprofit work. I was working in commercial real estate in Southern California and hated it. And someone introduced me to a gentleman named Mark Reed and said, he does something with marketing for good causes, right? Well, it turned out that Mark Reed is Russ Reed's son, and Russ was the founder of the organization named after him. That was one of the early direct response fundraising agencies that served nonprofit organizations. So I got in there almost 25 years ago now, and have been doing this work ever since.
Never looked back.
Nope. Did a small. I worked with you probably know Kelly England. She and I did about a 3-year stint together working on political fundraising. But I've been focused on nonprofit ever since.
Yeah. Interesting. So I was virtually flipping through your Mistakes That Nonprofits Make book, and I have tons of questions about it. So first of all, how did you compile these mistakes over the years, or did you sort of sit down and, it's just sort of like they flow because we see them so often?
Yeah, here's what happened. In 2009, I went on the road and I ended up meeting with about 80 charities over a couple of months. And about halfway through those meetings, it hit me, because every time I'd walk into one of those, CEO's offices, I'd hear something like, we have this big problem. And as they'd explain it, I started to realize, like, I'm hearing the same issues over and over again in all these different organizations. It's almost like I could like rinse and repeat each time I walked in the building. And it was these, these mistakes that if you've been in this industry long enough, you kind of go, yeah, everybody's tried that. Everybody's guilty of that. We've all made that mistake. And I thought to myself, like, why isn't there a resource to help people who are new to the sector and who just maybe have never had the opportunity to see it that way, to have a tool to say, hey, these are already proven bad ideas. Let's not do them anymore. I'm all for let's go out and test new things and try new things and make mistakes. Just don't make the same mistake, right? So once that kind of idea crystallized, then I just brought together 25 or so of my friends in the industry and said, let's build a resource for the sector around that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what's interesting about it is, I love that it's so hands-on and so practical, right? Like you can read it and you can sort of reflect on what's happening, or, what you're getting right or where you should be rethinking.
Yeah.
But what I found really curious, very little of it is about, oh, you're using the wrong ask string, or you're fundraising. It's not the kind of the tactics and strategies of fundraising or communications or those sorts of things. A lot of it is sort of people focused. A lot of items are around how we manage. And, I feel like 10 years ago, we weren't talking about culture in the same way we are talking about it today. But a lot of your mistakes point to cultural challenges and cultural issues. So what was the thinking behind that?
Yeah, I'm glad that came through that way, because it's so important. What I've found in all my years doing this is that when a chief development officer or a board member or an executive director says, we have a fundraising problem, when you get a couple layers deeper into the problem, you realize, no, your poor fundraising results are just an indicator of a people and a culture and a leadership problem in like 95% of the instances, right? Yeah. There's very few instances where there's a lack of money. There's very few instances where your charity is just so obscure that you can't motivate people to support it. But there's a very high likelihood that either there's a toxic environment, or we're not enabling people to be successful, or we're creating roadblocks for people to be able to achieve a goal. And so that's why I spent so much time in that book focusing on the culture pieces and the leadership and the people development, because those really drive everything.
Well, and you kind of break down into specific tension points. So it's not just sort of have positive, good culture, like that's easier said than done, but you really kind of looked at a few very specific topics. And maybe I can kind of do a speed round with you on this one.
Sure.
Low cost, high value employees. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So, if anybody who's been in this sector long enough has heard something like, well, we really want a great development officer, but our budget's $32,000 a year. What can we get for that? Right. And so rather than organizations saying, wait a minute, if we want to achieve, say we need to raise $5 million to fund a new program for our organization, you're not going to get there by hiring someone who's never done it before, who has no experience, who's not going to have any training, who you're not going to coach, you're not going to send for professional development because you're keeping your budget low. That's going to create just a cycle of turnover. And if you get incremental gain, if you get a 2% increase in your revenue next year because that person worked their butt off in spite of not having any of the training or tools or support, that'd be a win, in theory, but it's not going to get you where you need to go. Right. And unfortunately, because of that sort of scarcity mindset that a lot of organizations live in and haven't figured out how to break out of, it's so often the case that we hire people well below what any normal human being would need to be paid for a role like that, and then we put these astronomical objectives and expectations on them. So there's no way that you're actually going to be successful, and that person's going to be gone in 8 to 12 months.
So you get what you pay for.
Absolutely, yeah.
You talked about processes over outcomes, and I thought that was a really good thing to talk about. And professionally, but also just personally, you think about, it's not about the process; it's sort of the end goal. So that really kind of rang true with me.
Yeah, we're seeing that right now because of what's gone on from the pandemic. One of the biggest conversations I'm having with organizations is how do I get my people back to work, back in the office? And I keep asking the question like, why do you want them back in the office, right? And I had a leader say to me last week, well, I want to make sure they're doing the work. And I said back like, okay, well, if they're achieving the objectives, don't you know they're doing the work, right? And it was like a foreign concept. So I think the cultural idea of like I have to have butts in seats, I have to be able to see their heads bobbing up above their cube to know that they're there and that we're quote unquote getting value out of them.
Sure.
That's a very old school kind of command and control leadership style, and it really doesn't work today. So I think more than anything, what I would encourage organizations to do is set your objectives, and those objectives are should be outcome based. We want to house more people. We want to care for more women who've been abused. We want to rescue more people from trafficking. We want to save more animals, whatever they are. And then, the sort of the sub point objectives under that. In order to achieve this, we need to do X, Y, and Z. And those are what people ought to be measured against, right? Not did I get there to the office by 8 a.m. or, oh my gosh, was it 8:15 and am I a loser because of that, right? But unfortunately, I think there are still a lot of people who prefer to manage instead of lead, and that's where you get sort of those process-driven success metrics versus outcome-driven.
Yeah, I've heard the recruiters joke around that the second a company announces full-time mandatory back in the office, that's when they start poaching employees. So it's people may want to live with their goats.
I do it too. I mean, when I see organizations that are saying, we're getting people back into the office, my recruitment team gets on the phone and we start talking to those people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's our values. I mean, past 2 years, but even leading up to it, I think our values of flexibility and what it really means, like who wants to spend 2 hours commuting or
right.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. So the other one, you started talking about toxic leadership, and I've heard you talk about this lately. But before we get to that, you mentioned that one of the mistakes is hiring for-profit executives to run nonprofits. And I happen to agree with that. But why did you zoom in on that particular topic? Because for a hot second, there seemed to be this this narrative of, well, for-profits certainly have more resources and more evolved, more sophisticated systems. So there was definitely a little bit of sense of being enamored with for-profit executives. So why is that a mistake?
Yeah, I would say it's one of those things where there are people who've come from the for-profit sector who probably do phenomenally well in nonprofit organizations. And similarly, there are people who've spent their career in nonprofits that transition into a for-profit role and also do phenomenally well.
Yeah.
So it's not a never kind of thing. But I think the mistake that particularly boards make is they make this assumption that, well, if I'm hiring someone who's come from the corporate world, they are no doubt immediately smarter, more knowledgeable, and more capable than anyone that I have in my shop today.
Right.
And first of all, I think that's just a crappy way to think about life. And what does it say about your people and the talent development that you have going on in-house if that's the way that you approach your hiring strategy? And when we think about the drivers of success in the for-profit world, with very few exceptions, it's all about maximizing profit, maximizing shareholder value, and increasing brand for sales.
Mm-hmm.
It's not to say that increasing brand for, say, fundraising isn't a bad thing. It's a very good thing. Maximizing profit in the nonprofit sector, also a very good thing, because profit is how you accomplish mission, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But if we don't have people who understand that there's something bigger than profit, that creates problems. Also, I think that one of the things that we learn is that those who are mission driven, who say, yes, I want to make a fair wage and make a good living while doing good in the world, there's just a different mindset that folks like that in our sector bring to the work. That's not typically what I see when people transition from a commercial or for-profit role into a nonprofit role. I think the other thing that no one ever talks about, or if they do, it's very, very sparing, is helping people who want to make that transition understand just what the resource constraints are.
Yeah.
And that, it's not going to be like it was when you were at Apple. You're not going to be able to just turn around and say, hey, I need 37 more bodies in order to get this done, right? Yep. Or I need $1 million investment in technology. You've consulted with enough nonprofits. You walk in and people are like, hey, we spent $35,000 6 years ago to build this, and how can we modify it today on a $5,000 investment? Mm-hmm. Which is dramatically different than most people in a commercial role are used to. It's so different that it creates a lot of friction.
No, I would totally agree with that. It's about meeting people where they are, because if I recommend something that you simply don't have resources to implement, or your board doesn't want to prioritize it, it really does you no good. So yeah. I would argue that it's a lot harder to be in nonprofit space, where a lot of what we market for fundraising, for communications purposes, is much more abstract than, mm-hmm. Tube of toothpaste has specific benefits and attributes, and you have to have it, right?
Yeah.
Totally. So it's a lot easier to sell something like that than, feeling of making a difference and doing something positive in the world, things that are much more high concept. Yeah. We started talking a little bit about kind of the scarcity mindset and sort of where nonprofits on culture and people aspects fall short from fundraising. But one question I've been grappling with, is there such thing as a nonprofit that's just not fundraisable? Like topics that are just not something that resonates with donors?
That's a really interesting question. I don't know that I've ever, in almost 25 years, come across an organization that's not fundraisable in one way or another. Mm-hmm. I think there are certainly some causes that lend themselves to one type of fundraising versus another. Mm-hmm. So, for example, we often find, most of my business is direct response fundraising. So digital marketing, direct mail, DRTV, connected TV, that kind of stuff. We find that things that are really hard for people to see from an emotional perspective make it difficult to work in direct response. So domestic abuse, right? There's a good portion of the public that is uncomfortable seeing the aftermath of domestic abuse. Yeah. So it makes it hard to make that work in direct mail or even digital marketing, because people kind of go, oh, I don't really want to know that exists, right? So that something like that might be the case. There are certain other things, medical research, for example. That's a lot easier of a fundraising pitch and sell in a face-to-face sort of major gift environment, maybe at some certain types of special events, maybe harder in other fundraising venues, right? So I don't know that there are any that are just completely not fundraisable, but I do think there are plenty where you have to be selective about how you go about the fundraising.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. So, Andrew, you produce a podcast. You've written books. I see you sharing content, articles, all sorts of things all the time. My question to you is, what content do you consume to kind of inform you, to inspire you, to, or maybe just to decompress, so, I love talking to content creators, not just from the perspective of what is it that they create, but what do they like to read, listen, watch?
Yeah. So a couple of thoughts on that. I have about 40 different podcasts in my phone, and they're all over the map, right? So there are some that are true crime. There are some that are professional development. There's a lot of different news, and I like to get a broad spectrum of reporting. So, not just NPR, not just MSNBC, not just CNN, but, BBC, for example, to get an international perspective and to see and hear different stories. And then a lot of I actually have a lot of content on content development, a lot on leadership. HBR is a daily go-to for me. So it runs the gamut there. I'm happy to share the list with you later, and you can share it if you want. Book-wise, I find it difficult to read fiction books, so I don't do a lot of that. The bookcase behind me is all nonfiction, and it's either leadership. There's biographies from certain key people in history, a lot of personal development and things of that nature. And then I've got a lot of the Harvard Business Review magazines behind me as well. And then my guilty pleasure is Netflix series. So Narcos and Peaky Blinders are my favorite.
Okay.
And then because I have a 4-year-old, a whole lot of PBS cartoons.
Okay, so I like cartoons, and my kids don't watch like PBS type of cartoons anymore,
Okay.
but sometimes I'll get up and I'll watch cartoons while everyone else is asleep. So that's my guilty pleasure once in a while.
If I could find old school cartoons like from when we were growing up, I can't find them anywhere on our television, but some of those old ones I would totally be game for.
Yeah, Pinky and the Brain.
Yeah, oh yeah, yep.
Good one. Always good one. Well, cool. Well, thank you so much for joining me this morning. This was wonderful. It's nice to see you face to face, but I feel like we've never sort of disconnected. So I just really appreciate you coming, and thank you for bringing goat named Aoife to visit us.
You are very welcome. Thanks for inviting me, and welcome back to the States.
All right. See you soon.